So this year, during the season of Lent, we decided to do some storytelling. Many of you have likely listened to the Moth Radio Hour on public radio, or maybe been to other storytelling events. What we wanted to do was modeled off of that approach to storytelling. Now here at First Christian, over the season, we did this by having one storyteller in worship each Sunday. But at the end of the season, we wanted to put these together. So now we are creating a storytelling event. Our stories were in response to the prompt, stories of faith, mind, body, heart, and soul. And the stories that you will hear here, I promise will draw you in and hopefully evoke something within you, not least of all, the desire to tell your own story. So our first storyteller is Vern Duba, who, although a Nebraskan by birth, if you asked him, would tell you that New York City is his favorite place to visit. He was, and I want to get this right, the 1979 4-H Nebraska champion chicken judge. And knowing that there is a town named Duba in the Czech Republic, he often aspires to run for mayor after he retires. Mayor Duba of Duba. I invite you to hear his story.
I'm from western Nebraska. Early on, I realized how problematic this was when everyone thought I was from Scottsbluff or Chadron. You see, western Nebraska is in southeastern Nebraska, and that was the confusion. If you're familiar with Omaha, and who here isn't familiar with Omaha, Interstate 80 runs along the south side of that city. The Kennedy Freeway crosses over, and at that exact point, I grew up 100 miles southwest of there. The farm I grew up on technically was not in western Nebraska, but 7 miles north of western Nebraska. The land was homesteaded in 1874. The second piece was homesteaded in 1876. My dad, in fact, was born on that property in the house that his grandparents built. It was wonderful growing up in the country. I absolutely loved it. We had a small creek that ran through our property that emptied into a spring-fed pond on the south side of the property that we came to call the Water Squirrels. The reason we called it the Water Squirrels is my older brother, as a child, saw the muskrats swimming, but didn't have a word for muskrat. So he called them water squirrels, and it stuck. On the north end of the property was a prairie pasture with huge cottonwood trees. So think of an arbor of trees, a grove of trees, huge. I recall with my little sister holding and hugging the trunk, and our fingertips didn't touch. It was an amazing place because it created a leaf canopy that shaded the summer sun, and it was a great place for us to play. The wind of through those leaves was a deafening sound because Nebraska has a very windy climate. In the fall, when those leaves would dry and rustle, it was almost deafening to be in that grove. I actually called it the Cottonwood Cathedral because it was so majestic to be in, and we spent a lot of time playing there. I have 3 stories to tell you about that pasture. The first is, my dad had created a gate from 2 of the existing trees closest to the barn. He had connected the barbed wire fence to those trees and built a gate that we could open or close depending on if we needed to keep the cattle in or out. One late summer afternoon, we saw storm clouds coming, so my mom said that we needed to bring the cows home from the pasture. My job was to get the barn ready so that I could turn them in once they were in the pen. I did my chores and my mom and sister were still not there, so I went around the barn to see where they were. As I approached those two cottonwood gate posts, a lightning bolt struck one of them. Now, I was 7 at the time, so I don't quite remember, but what I do remember is a bright flash of light, bark flying, and me flying or falling over. Luckily, everything was okay and I was not hurt, but it was a lasting memory. The second story I have is my little sister and I were playing in the Cottonwood Cathedral, and we heard a whimpering mewling of something that we knew was out of the ordinary. Turns out there were 4 kitten-sized baby raccoons. Now, how did I know they were kitten-sized? Because when we reached in the hollowed out cottonwood tree to take them out and play with, we saw that they were tiny. Their teeth were not strong enough to puncture our skin, and their little claws were not sharp enough to scratch us. So when we finished playing with them, we carefully put them back in the hollowed out cottonwood tree, went into the house for supper, washed up, and proudly told our story. Dad's face went solemn. Mom's eyes got as big as the dinner plates, and my older sister said, "Are you crazy? They have rabies." Well, it turned out, luckily, we were safe and we were fine, but we learned a valuable lesson for interfacing with Mother Nature. Those 2 stories were one-off. They each happened once in my life. The last story I want to leave you with is the story that happened every fall for many years and has lasting impact for me. Usually around the 7th or 8th of September, we started to see monarch butterflies around the house garden. We knew that it was time to head out to the Cottonwood Cathedral to see the monarchs. As it turns out, our farm was a stop on their migratory path, and they would collect there for about 2 weeks. As we approached the trees, we could see the orange and black specks. As we got even closer, we could see them collected on the leaves, on the bark. And we learned if we held our arms out very still, they would light on us. They would even land on our heads, and we could watch them if we were very careful. This was an inspiring scene for me. Even as a kid, I was thinking, where did they come from? How were they created? Are they as aware of me as I am aware of them? And how can that delicate little body and those delicate little wings carry them on this huge, huge journey that they were on? I have to tell you that I didn't go to the Cottonwood Cathedral to find God, but that's where God found me.
Next, you will hear from Kent Clark. Around First Christian, many of us are familiar with Kent's ability to fundraise. After all, he recently chaired our capital campaign. But Kent is more than that. He has a love for water. For over 20 years, he has tied flies, that's a fishing term for those who aren't familiar, and has been able to demonstrate at shows and expos in 3 states. And in 2023, he and his wife Rebecca went to sailing school. But today, we will hear about a different, unexpected journey.
34%. Last year at this time, Becky and I took a terrific sunny vacation, one of the best of our lives, and I was looking at my photos the other day, and 34% of my pictures, 93 out of 270 photographs, were of sunsets. It sounds a little extreme, but I think that's probably a pretty typical ratio for me. I never tire of the dramatic sights that nature affords us. Sunrises and sunsets, mountains and oceans. In March of 2008, I thought I saw a flash of lightning, oddly on a clear day, and unaccompanied by thunder. When some other symptoms appeared, and with a family history of retina trouble, I knew enough to go see my local ophthalmologist that very morning. Within 2 hours of my lightning flash, I sat in the passenger seat while Becky drove us the 90 miles to a retina specialist in Salt Lake City. Early the next morning, I had a complicated surgery to repair my retinal tear on my right eye that the doctor described as catastrophic. In an attempt to save some of my vision, the doctor filled my eye with inert silicone oil to protect the repair. The good news, he said, is I think I got it in time. The bad news is we won't know for 3 months. And during that time, you won't be able to see anything other than shadows. My other eye was okay at the moment, but it had never seen well. Profoundly nearsighted and lazy. I could see, but not enough to maintain normal activities. Couldn't really read. I was able to get around inside our home, but paranoid when I left the house, fearful of falling. Driving was completely out of the question. I'm a little stubborn, and I put up a pretty good front of getting by. One day, Becky was at work, and the boys were in school, and I had to get out of the house. I put on dark glasses to protect against the bright mountain sun, and I was afraid I'd trip over the curb, so I grabbed a ski pole to balance myself, and I caught the city bus at a stop near our house. When the driver picked me up, he saw a guy with dark glasses and a white stick in his hand, and without asking, he lowered the bus, came and led me by the arm and seated me. I wanted to resist. I wanted to say, I can see a little bit, but I could not speak the words. I just allowed him to seat me, and I wondered if this was going to be my new normal. I was trying to radiate hope and confidence, but I was more scared than I'd ever been in my life. I didn't think I could do my job if I couldn't see, and I didn't know how to do anything else that would provide for my family. I wondered how I would manage. Would I qualify for disability? How on earth am I going to learn Braille with my fat fingers? At the time, I was so afraid for our family's economic future that I didn't give much thought to the impact on my psyche. It said the eyes are the window to the soul. Well, maybe, but more so than you're probably thinking. My eyes were the window out of my soul, my connection to the world. After months of healing, I had a follow-up procedure to remove the oil and determine if the repair had succeeded. When they removed the bandages and I looked around the exam room, I saw the machinery and the screen with letters and the Kleenex box on the counter so vividly remember. It was remarkable. But it wasn't until a little later that it sank in how profound this experience was. It was all the more memorable that at the time we lived in the mountains of Utah. That fall, I spent long days fishing in the high country, and each day I drank in the rich colors of the aspens and mahoganies, mountain maples, the majestic backdrop of the mountains and the stark beauty of the sagebrush flats. I will never forget what it was like to lose and regain my sight. When I get on an elevator, I trace my fat fingers over the Braille numbers, and I remember that time. And I never take a sunset for granted.
Next is Jill Michael, also known as the pastor of our congregation. While she's been a pastor since she was the age of 19, she's more than just that. When she was younger, she took an EMT class, but nowadays, you can't even trust her with more than a Band-Aid. More importantly, she's my mom, and I'm the baby in the story she's about to tell you.
Now I know that there have been Sonic restaurants around here, but in this area it seems like they come for a while and then leave. But when we lived in Southwest Missouri, they were plentiful. In fact, the closest restaurant to our house was a Sonic. Now, I don't know that I thought about it very much. Sure, I occasionally stopped for a drink poured over that crunchy ice that Sonic has perfected. If you've been to Sonic, you know what I'm talking about. And sometimes I had a hankering for a corn dog and some tater tots. But suddenly, Sonic became more important to me. It wasn't because I ate there more often, but because it became my hope that I could make it as far as that Sonic before my back pain made itself known. That restaurant, just about a mile from our home, became my landmark by which I would predict how my day was going to go. I don't even really know that it was technically back pain. It was the best description I had for it. It was right over here on my right side, and I could sometimes alleviate it by putting pressure there, or sometimes pressure right here at the bottom of my rib cage. I struggled to effectively describe what I was feeling to my doctor, but I couldn't deny that it was there. In fact, sometimes I still feel it. This was just a few months after that little stick had shown 2 lines. And no, I'm not talking about a COVID test. I stood in a friend's bathroom after we had had a conversation earlier in the day. I'd called her up and said, I missed a period. She excitedly said, be at my house at 2 o'clock. I'll have the pregnancy test. So here we were, a few months into this pregnancy. Jim and I were beginning to think about getting the house ready, but it was still early enough that we hadn't actually done any of that yet. I wasn't even wearing maternity clothes. If you didn't know I was pregnant, you wouldn't know I was pregnant. Yet I couldn't even drive a mile without pain reminding me. And at church, I would soon give in and shift from standing when I was preaching to sitting on a stool. Yes, that's right. I couldn't sit for very long, but I also couldn't stand for very long. This baby was taking over my body. As someone who had always felt, let's say, uncertain about chiropractors, I surprised myself when, upon my midwife's suggestion, I quickly made an appointment. Janine, who became our family chiropractor, was a lifesaver. With regular visits, we managed the pain, and I became more comfortable. It still seems funny to me that when Cameron was the size of a plum or the size of an apple, when it seems like there should have been plenty of room for him to exist without disrupting me, I was uncomfortable. But then, when he was more than 8 pounds and 11 days overdue, I felt great. It was in those later months, those final weeks of my pregnancy, that time when I felt fabulous, even though every movement I made was in concert with my protruding belly. It was then that I stood one Sunday at the communion table and was overcome. This is my body, given for you, I said as I held the bread out to the congregation. And in saying those words, I suddenly realized, in the creation of this child, I had given my body, and I would do it again and again. Jane Dorman spent years working with hospice. She is an advocate for dying well, but also for living well. While your first impression of Jane may be that she's gentle and soft-spoken, she also lives with a sense of adventure and a fierce commitment to justice. Her story will take you on a great adventure where she learned important things about happiness and a contented life.
My visits to Finland began in the spring of 2022. My husband was doing collaborative work with colleagues at the University of Eastern Finland as a part of his sabbatical, and I was fortunate to be able to join him. I had 2 questions that I pondered throughout our stays. First, why are the Finns considered to be the happiest people on earth? And second, how do they get through the long winters with such little sun? I found answers to these questions as time passed. Being so far north, the days in April were short. The temperature was in the 30s, and there was a lot of ice on the sidewalks. However, that did not stop people from getting out. Shale was scattered on the town sidewalks, which made it less likely to slip and fall. I ventured around in my new surroundings, and I was prepared to greet people in passing with a smile and a good morning. I quickly learned that the protocol was to make brief eye contact and then look away. No smiles. I remember thinking, they don't seem very happy. I asked various Finns why they felt they received international recognition for being the happiest people in the world. The most common answer was due to their commitment to social programs. They have universal health care coverage, free college, and quality child care and education. Their replies made sense, but I felt that there were also some cultural characteristics that explained their happiness. I continued to contemplate this question when we returned in the fall. The Finns have a few secrets that we can all learn from. Finns love nature, being outside and incorporating walking into their day. Half of the country is an archipelago, and over 188,000 lakes span the country. In the town where we stayed, there were streets designated for walking and bicycling only. People with mobility challenges were also out and about. I was impressed with the numerous and different devices that I saw. The Finnish people are resilient and prepared. Men who are 18 must do 1 year of mandatory service, either in the military or in the community. I expressed concern to locals about the military planes that I heard flying above, and was told that they were practicing in the event of a Russian invasion. "Don't worry," a friend said. "We can all hide in caves if needed. We have them throughout the country. We even have 200,000 extra spaces to accommodate visitors." And have you heard about the Finns and their saunas? The Finns' love for saunas runs deep. There are 1.2 saunas for every Finn. People have saunas in their homes, apartments, and cabins. Public saunas also exist, and there are even restaurants that have saunas. While sharing a meal with a group, I asked, "Do you all take saunas?" Everyone nodded yes. One person shared that during his childhood, his family took a sauna together every Wednesday and Sunday night. "Without clothes?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I asked another friend how he got through the beginning of the COVID pandemic. He replied, "I just took an extra sauna every day." I learned that Finns take saunas for extended periods of time, not for minutes, but for hours. As time passed, I asked various people how they get through the long winters with little sun. Besides taking saunas, they said that they may take a winter vacation. Others said that the snow really helps the days feel brighter. A friend shared that on Christmas Eve, families go to the cemetery and light candles for their loved ones. He said, "It's so beautiful with so much light reflecting from the snow." The response that will stay with me the most is, "It's fine. I just wait for the light. I know it's coming." If I am missing the sun on a cloudy day, I recall the wisdom of my Finnish friend. Be patient. Wait for the light. Know that it is coming. It always does.
Marian Hart also shares a story today. Throughout her life, Marian has served as an educator, as a caregiver, and as a pastor. She is an avid camper, and she is a fierce pickleball player. She is a creative spirit and a lover of God and people. It is her commitment to care for people that drives her to work for justice and mercy.
The summer our son Richard turned 15, he lost 50 pounds. When the weight loss began, we just thought it was a normal male adolescent growth spurt where he would get taller and skinnier. But people started remarking about it, and I started being more observant. So right before school started, I decided I needed to make a doctor's appointment for him and have things checked out. And by the time the appointment came, I had grown more concerned, as his hands were so thin that I could see every bone in them. I began to grow fearful. My family has a large percentage history of cancer, and so I was imagining only worst case scenarios. The doctor asked Richard a myriad of questions, ruling out the normal teenage maladies such as drug use, anorexia, bulimia, diabetes. He was unable to diagnose a reason for the weight loss, and it kept progressing, to the point that I felt like my son was starving to death before my very eyes, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. We tried to get Richard into the University of Iowa. Our insurance wanted us to go to Peoria, Illinois. So Arnie began a battle with them, spending hours on the telephone, arguing and fighting for the right for health care. Finally, we were permitted to make an appointment in Iowa City, but none was available for less than a month out. By then, I was in a panic, feeling in my gut that we did not have a month. Somehow, we were referred to a pediatric gastrointestinal specialist in Davenport, and we got in right away. By this time, I had been praying and praying and praying, but I no longer knew how to ask or pray anymore. My fear had taken over and logjammed my ability to connect with God. The night before the appointment with the specialist, I was finally able to cry out in surrender, and I said to God that I was willing to accept whatever was wrong, but I needed a name to put to it. The specialist immediately admitted Richard into the hospital, saying, "We are going to start pumping some high-calorie nutrients into him. His body has not been able to absorb that from his food, and his organs are beginning to shut down. First thing tomorrow, we will do a colonoscopy and an endoscopy, and I feel certain that we will find that he has Crohn's disease, and it is treatable." Well, I had an answer to my prayer, though I'd never heard of Crohn's disease before. I had a name to put on what I felt we were fighting. Richard was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. While in the hospital, we were warned that those with chronic disease, especially young people, oftentimes will suffer from depression as well. And that has been the case. For nearly 24 years, Richard has suffered with 2 life-threatening diseases. We've all been affected in body, mind, and spirit. There have been numerous hospitalizations, infusions, meds, therapists, and stigmas to figure out and deal with. Richard is a champion. I wanted to tell this story as a witness to the power of prayer over fear. But as I was trying to put it into words, I saw that just as Richard didn't know all the things going on with me and Arnie and insurance, etc., 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 as we worked behind the scenes to find him help, I often don't know how God is working behind the scenes in my life, fighting battles that I know nothing about, but always being on my side. So today, I am grateful for God's help and fierce love for all of us.
Friends, this is our final story, at least for this particular segment. And our final storyteller is John Fever. John has a passion for travel. He has been to 49 of the 50 states in our country. He once spent 6 months backpacking the world, and he frequently visits his ancestral homeland of England. As you will hear, John is not afraid to try new things and to take risks.
20 years ago, my brother Tim and my nephew Nathan and I went to Africa to climb Mount Kenya, a 17,000-foot extinct volcano. And as we were trekking many days to get there, we arrived at base camp, and I stood there, and I looked up at this intimidating, imposing mountain, 17,000 feet high, and the clouds were swirling above it, and I thought, there is no way I can climb this mountain. So my brother and nephew are much more experienced climbers than I am, and I told them that I didn't feel prepared to climb this mountain, and I really was not ashamed to be afraid. As it turned out, I started getting a severe headache and some symptoms of altitude sickness, and I was instructed to go to a lower base camp before nightfall to avoid nocturnal high altitude cerebral edema, which can be fatal. So I went down to a lower camp that night, spent the night. The next morning I got up and headed back up to the base camp in time to see my brother, my nephew, coming down the mountain. And I greeted them and congratulated them, and we were all excited. And but inside I kind of felt like, you know, I had chickened out and that I had failed somehow. And so it's like, well, anyway. But my story does not end there. There is another mountain in Africa, the world's tallest freestanding mountain, a dormant volcano, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Many of you have heard of it, Mount Kilimanjaro. We get in the car, then we drive from Kenya to Tanzania, and again we start trekking over many days through. There are 5 distinct climate zones on Mount Kilimanjaro: cultivation zone, rainforests, highland, moor and meadow, desert, alpine desert, and Arctic zones. So after getting through these zones, we arrive at the base camp. We're acclimatized. We're ready for a 2 a.m. ascent to try to get to the summit by sunrise. Well, I'm sitting in my tent that late afternoon. I have a splitting headache again, and it had started to snow, and I'm thinking to myself, oh no, you know, I'm fearful, A, because this mountain's intimidating too, and B, I thought, what if I have to descend to another camp? I don't get to the top of this mountain, I fail again. I'm thinking these things, and apparently I fell asleep because at 2 a.m. our guide is outside the tent and waking us up. And I get up, my headache is gone. It had stopped snowing. So I put on my coat, we put on our headlamps. It's a beautiful starry night. There are just millions of stars in the sky. And you could see ahead going up the side of the mountain, the little tiny lights for another climbing party. And you could see their lights going up ahead of us. So we begin climbing. It's sort of a gradual ascent at this point, and as we get closer, we had chosen to climb the Western Breach, which is a steep and rocky route up the western side of the mountain. And so as we get closer, we're climbing fairly steadily, and then soon it starts becoming steeper, and now we're in a single file, one above the other, and we're climbing, and suddenly we come to a stop. Well, a message comes down, the guide needs an ice axe. What had happened during the night was the snow and the ice had sort of blocked our route, and he needed this ice axe to clear the way. Oh, so I'm thinking, now I'm getting kind of fearful again. And as he clears the route and we start climbing again, and things are pretty calm, and as the route starts to level off a little bit, we come up and it levels off, and we're hit with these strong gusts of wind, and it's all windy, and so I'm pulling on my coat and my hat, and you know, I'm elated thinking we made it, we're at the top of this mountain. Well, as it turns out, to my dismay, it was actually just a saddle between one peak and the true summit. So we start trekking again. Now we're going through the snow, and my feet just are like lead. This is probably 17 or 18,000 feet, and it's hard to breathe, and I'm taking maybe 2 steps or 3 steps at a time, stopping to gasp, catch my breath, take a few more steps, gasp for air. The guides keep saying pole, pole, which means slow, slow. At this point, we're starting to climb again, and I'm just thinking to myself, oh dear God, just get me off this mountain. Get me to the top of this mountain, or off the mountain one way or the other. And about that time, in the sort of clear, thin air, I hear my brother's voice say, hey John, you're almost there. You've just about made it. You can do it. And sure enough, as I get a little closer and the sky's getting light, I can see where it's leveling off. I see a group of people up ahead and these signposts which indicate the summit, and I thought, I've made it, and I have tears in my eyes. I'm exhausted, I'm exhilarated, and I just say, thank you, God, because it was so amazing, truly, truly awesome. At that point, we're probably, the summit is 19,341 feet, so we're way above the clouds, and the sky is starting to light up, and it's all orange and pink and purple and yellow streaks, and the clouds are all lit up, and you can see distant mountains and the sun coming up behind them. And so we all gather, and we're all hugging each other and giving high fives and taking photos. And I just remember being so grateful to God for that opportunity and the ability to do that. So we just take some final marvelous views and turn around and slowly start heading for the other side of the mountain, and a long gradual descent back to the bottom.